Now, when I lecture in England or when I lecture to young people, I always feel that I need to make the point that, unlike today, religion was very important in the past. And that, unlike today, people really believed in God. Or statements like this. Because, particularly in England, society there is so secular, and so few people attend church or have any kind of formal connection with a religious establishment of any kind. And while I often feel at times when I circulate around in my workplace that Northern Ireland is a bit like that now, we all know deep down that that's not true. And that there is still a significant impact of religion on Northern Ireland society. And that there is a significant impact then of both political religion and personal religious beliefs on policy making, on society. As we've been finding out over the last couple of weeks, the influence of religious ideas on various government ministers. It can continue to cause waves within the existing state. So with that kind of a preface then, what I'd like to do tonight is to follow a very similar format to that I've been adopting so far in this series, which is to look at religion in Ireland more broadly and look at some of the big changes and developments that took place over the last 200 years. And then look at this impact more locally within the area of Kilwater and North Antrim. And hopefully then finish off with sort of a brief discussion of how you might try to understand your own family's religious context in greater depth. In particular, what I'm hoping to do in tonight's lecture is to try and avoid, I think, what a lot of historians of religion, of whom I am one, tend to do, which is to emphasize, I suppose, the political nature and the political involvement of the churches, their contribution to big national debates, and so on, and to emphasize more and to look more at this notion of piety, this notion of the way in which people's personal faith or their commitment to a church institution has influenced their behavior and the way in which they have expressed their religious beliefs, however true or not they may be, in public ways. But I hope in this respect that I'm not sort of teaching everybody things that they already know or that they already understand. Because what I wanted to do, and what I often do when I give lectures on religion, is to sort of look first of all at the structural outline of the various denominations. And to give ourselves a sort of a framework for understanding religious change in Ireland in recent centuries. Okay, so, and I'm sure PRONI would appreciate this if it's going out over the internet, if I, make a few allowances. So you will forgive me if I'm telling you things that you already know. So we know, obviously, that Ireland was almost an exclusively Christian country over the past 200 years. And that really the number of non-Christians on the island of Ireland were in single digits. And I think that the 1861 census, which is the first time that religion is recorded officially within the census, lists 2 or 3 non-Christians. A Sikh woman, I think, pops up in Dublin. And there is a small but significant Jewish community as well. And so their traditions in particular should be acknowledged, but they won't be examined in this lecture today. Today I'm going to be focusing on the major Christian denominations, which, as we all know, are the Catholic Church, the Church of Ireland, and the Presbyterian Church in Ireland. Now, in the sort of 1750s, which is roughly speaking about where I'm starting from about now, the Anglican Church was the established church. And what that meant really was that the Church of England had an official relationship with the state. It was officially endorsed by the state. The state had enacted special legislation which gave it a certain role, a certain responsibility, and certain privileges. And in essence, the state gave the church the responsibility for looking after the religious beliefs of the entire population. And this is a very early modern idea, this notion that the religion of the state and should be the religion of the people, and that and it comes from a time when religious ideas could potentially have resulted in either treasonous behavior or the emergence of a potentially rebellious section of the population. So that for many states which were in formation in the early modern period, having a population which was in its entirety a single denomination was seen to be not only morally correct, but also politically, to ensure political security for the state. In Ireland, as we know, this never really happened very successfully, in that after the Reformation, the British state is not effective or able to get the extension of Protestantism across the island of Ireland. Nor was it really able to secure the, consolidation of Protestantism, in that very quickly after the Reformation, a group of dissenting Protestants emerged of varying forms. So these included groups like the Baptists and Independents, Huguenots, Quakers, and other Reformed traditions who, for a variety of reasons, migrate to Ireland. So together, these dissenting Protestants form a small yet significant proportion of the population. Later on in the 19th century, you see the emergence of Methodists, and then later on the emergence of like the Plymouth Brethren, who have a significant force, and then in the 20th century, the emergence of a Pentecostal movement, which brings about the emergence of the Elam churches. All of these in the 18th century would fall under the category of either nonconformist or dissenter, terms which mean Protestants who are not Anglican. Now, if we look at the proportions of these respective denominations on the island of Ireland, we know from about Irish people knew from about the 1830s that the majority of the population were Catholic. But other documents show us that this proportion existed long before then. So the hearth tax rolls of the 1730s revealed that about 73% of Catholic-headed, or of families on the island of Ireland were headed by Catholics. Historians have, using subsequent information, revised those figures upwards, and they estimate that probably in around the 1730s, likely upwards of 79% of all families would have been Catholic. Now, another big survey of religious adherence was the reports of the Commissioners of Public Instruction in 1834, and they're the ones who give us these statistics that I'm showing you here, where the Church of Ireland represents 10.7% of the population, Presbyterians 8.1%, and Catholics 80.9%. Another review, the Census of Ireland in 1861, which provides a much more detailed religious breakdown of the Irish population, reflects very, very similar trends. You can see Catholics representing 77.6% of the total population, and the Church of Ireland 11.9%, and Presbyterians 8.7%. This reflects what historians know is the fact that the relative proportions of the religious denominations on the island of Ireland remain surprisingly stable. I'm sure many Protestants in the 19th century would have been deeply disappointed by this. And it's really from 1861 that we get our top line figures about religious adherence in Ireland. And really I suppose we should be grateful, because in England, the only time there was a religious census was in 1851. And so Ireland is really, I suppose, quite specially placed in terms of the amount of headline data that it has for religious adherence, in that religion was surveyed in every Irish census between 1861 and partition. So there's a great trend, and the information goes down as far as parish level in the printed censuses, which are available as parliamentary papers published by the House of Commons. Now, we're also interested, obviously, to look at geographical spread. And I'm apologizing that I don't have a map that reflects the geographical spread in the 19th century. For this data is taken from the 1970s. But I think that it's very interesting in that it reflects, again, the geographical spread that was recognized in the 19th century, which is that really outside of the province of Ulster, Catholics form a majority in every single county, and that within Ulster, Presbyterians form a significant majority, and yet their presence is negligible everywhere else, and whereas Anglicans are spread more thinly across the country as a whole. I mean, I think what's interesting is, again, the significance of Presbyterianism, which is Presbyterians form majority communities in at least 2 Ulster counties, Antrim and Down, and they outnumber Anglicans in the province of Ulster in the 19th century by a ratio of about 3 to 2. So they really are a substantial and a very coherent community, which of course, as we know, has significant implications for the political and social development of the north of Ireland. So as I've suggested in my discussion of the Anglican Church, Ireland in the 18th century is what's called a confessional state. It is meant to be Anglican, and it has a state church. The state church was entitled to privileges, and those who weren't members of it were penalized or punished. This obviously caused substantial grievances. It led to substantial amounts of both social and political unrest, and it meant that the Church of Ireland as an institution became a significant target over the course of the 19th century. And we'll come and talk about that in a second. Just to confirm, with the dark pink being the percentage of Catholics, you can see the extent to which the very regional nature of Protestant distribution across the island of Ireland, even in the 1970s. Okay, so what I want to do now is to look a little bit more at each one of the denominations and how they were each organized. Now, this speaks to the geek or in me, and that, but I also think that as a historian, we all need to be a bit trained spotty about the institutions that impact, particularly on our family's history. And if we're engaging in church records, it all behooves us to really have a sense of the structure of the institution and the way in which it produced documents, if for no other reason. And so I indulged my train spotting tendencies today by drafting a number of key documents or key diagrams, which I think illustrate very well the organizational structure of the denominations, which will hopefully enlighten the forthcoming discussion. So, if we look here at the structure of the Anglican Church, what's significant about Anglican church structures is that it's based on territory. So it's based on a conception of the island as a whole, and their entitlement, in essence, to occupy that territory. So they take the entire unit of Ireland and they divide it up into chunks. Okay? And then each chunk is then meant to have a church attached to it. Okay? So this is the basis of what religious historians call the diocesan system, okay, or the Episcopalian system. Okay, and that it's territorially based, rather than based on, say, population or numbers, or on small regions. Okay, and we'll see other examples of church structure in a second. Okay, so if you take my square as roughly being Ireland, okay, what I've done is the large squares, in essence, divide the country up into provinces, of which there were, for most of the 19th century, 4 within the Anglican Church. Each province is then divided up into dioceses, right, which is one of those horrible words to pronounce. Each diocese is then subsequently divided up into parishes. Now, you have an archdiocese, and you have a primatial, I suppose, province, which for the Anglican Church is Armagh. Okay, so the Archdiocese is where the Archbishop of Armagh, who is the head of the Anglican Church in Ireland, it's where he is resident. Okay, and within that diocese there will be a cathedral, especially big, large church with lots of extra functions added to it that makes it different from a parish church. Okay, now so basic structure, okay, this doesn't really change. Well, it does change dramatically in the 19th century in that it is reduced in size and extent and number for the Anglican Church substantially in the 1830s. But just hold that for a second. So if we look then at a parish in a little bit more detail, in the 19th century, the way Anglicans perceived, I suppose, their organization was that you needed to have enough ground or land in order to support a minister. Okay, so they're quite often then the parish units upon which were the basis in Ireland, which were based on medieval origins, they weren't sufficient enough to generate a sufficient income for a minister. So quite often parishes would be clustered together to form an economic unit. Okay? And this is based on the fact that the church, which owned the land on which the parish was based, would lease out that land as farms to surrounding farmers. Sometimes in the 18th century, the minister would actually farm some of that land himself. Okay? Now, so parishes that were uneconomic on their own would be clustered together in what was called a benefice. Okay? And so that's the kind of the little unit that you've got here. Kilwater is in fact part of a cluster with Castle, which is the parish directly north to it. So Kilwater has never had an Anglican church in it, and everybody who was Anglican in Kilwater was expected to go north to Castle and attend the church there. The two parishes have always been united in terms of their income and have always had a single clergyman responsible for the pair of them. Okay? So Kilwater is a great example of a benefice, several parishes together. The other thing, again, that I was talking about is this notion of a parish ideal. In the 18th century, the state said, right, we need to have local presence. So we'll take every parish, and the ideal will be that we'll have a church in the parish, and we'll also then have a little house for the minister to live in, and he's going to need a bit of an income, so we'll include some land around his house. That'll help with his income. This bit of house and land were quite often placed within townlands which are called glebes. And again, Kilwater reflects this in that one of the townlands in Kilwater is called glebe. That's where the Castle minister actually lived. Okay, and there was a small chunk of property which surrounded it. Okay. Now within this church, the church structure, you would have the minister. Now I've been using minister to refer to small m minister, right? Because in fact, depending on the kind of benefice you had, would depend on the title which the minister could formally claim. Okay? Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail. There's a whole book of several hundred pages if anyone's interested afterwards. But the most common terms relate to the most common types of benefices, which would include rector, vicar, or what was known as a perpetual curate. So these are formal titles which refer to the financial arrangements surrounding the benefice which the minister was occupying. Okay? Now, within his church, then the minister would quite often, if it was large enough, would have a curate. A curate is a minister who's just graduated and is therefore eligible for exploitation on all levels, as all recent graduates are. and the Church of Ireland was no different. And so he was paid peanuts. He quite often in the 18th century would have had to carry out all of the parish duties because many Anglican ministers were not resident and didn't live on the island of Ireland, or had several benefices that they were looking after and lived in another one and gave one to a curate to look after entirely. But a curate could never claim the income from the glebe lands, if there were such, or any income from the benefice. He was paid a salary by the minister itself. Okay. The minister also would have then had responsibility for a vestry. And a vestry is kind of a form of a church committee, except because the Church of Ireland was established, it meant that the vestry had taxation privileges at one point. It would have disciplinary and even judicial responsibility, okay, law and order, and it's not for a time. Okay, and then you have this position of sexton, which is like a church warden or a caretaker. Okay, so I've spent quite a lot of time on that, but it's quite complex. So if we look at the Catholic Church is organized in a very similar way. It runs on a territorial system, a diocesan system. But this diocesan system isn't as elaborate because it didn't have all of the land ownership that was associated, the land ownership complications that were associated with the Anglican Church. So you have dioceses and archdioceses and parishes, and you have then within a parish, very similar, you have the church with a priest often, and then a parish priest, which then gives the short form PP, which sometimes can be a bit confusing. And then he would have also had a curate who he would have exploited. And you might have had, say, a graveyard or a school next door. Again, the living arrangements for Catholic clergy were ad hoc and didn't always necessarily reside next to the church. Now, Presbyterian structures are very different because the Presbyterian Church, like most dissenting Protestant congregations, is based on the voluntary system, right? So the only reason you would become a Presbyterian in the past was because you wanted to, right? Because you believed that way, because it was a commitment that you had, right? If you didn't care about religion, you would just be an Anglican probably, right? And I know that sounds dreadful, but really, if there's a lot of penalties involved in being a Presbyterian, it would be something that you would have to want to do. Okay, so the Presbyterian Church then emerges organically over time. Congregations are established as more and more people find this a meaningful form of religious expression. And the more churches you get, the more you need to organize them in some way. And so this really develops then sort of more of what's called a gathered church structure, in that once you've got 2 or 3 churches together, well, you need to cluster them in a way. And the way Presbyterians did this was through what they call a sort of a series of church courts, but which we would really probably refer to as committees. And committees with then varying levels of authority. So in the 17th and the 18th century, the most senior committee within the Presbyterian Church was a synod. Okay? And within that synod, there would be a cluster of presbyteries. And within each presbytery, you would have then a cluster of congregations. Okay? And the right to attend presbytery then was all ministers and a selection of senior elders from within each congregation. Okay, now, minister, okay, runs the congregation. Nevertheless, Presbyterians are quite proud of the fact that it's the congregation who issues what they call a call to a Presbyterian minister. So they are, in essence, deciding who their minister will be, and to an extent, he is answerable to them. And there's lots of situations in the 18th century where a minister kind of goes off the rails a little bit, and the congregation then decides to oust him, or relationships break down between minister and laity. Now, certain members then of the congregation would be, I'm not sure, really, off the top of my head, sorry, I haven't thought about this in a long time, are selected to be elders. And I think it's elected, thank you. It just kind of escaped me for a moment there. So there's an election process, right? And these become then lay leaders of the church who have responsibility to govern the affairs of the church through two main committees. The first of which is the session, which is really responsible for the religious leadership of the church and the religious strategy and direction that it was going in. It was also responsible for things like church discipline. And then you have, in the 19th century, increasingly, the addition of the second committee, which is called the committee, which is composed of both elders and laymen, and is responsible for the more sort of operational side of the church, the building, appointing the church warden, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's Presbyterianism. Now, very, very quickly, not to leave out the Methodists, although they are only 2% of much of the population. Methodists operate very similarly, but they call their gatherings of congregations circuits. And this dates back to the time when one minister or official professional minister would have been appointed to look after a series of congregations who we would have visited week on week in a circuit. And in the early days, this minister was called a traveling preacher because he wasn't ordained in any way. And when he wasn't preaching to the one church, other laymen from that local church would preach instead. And these became leaders within their congregations and were known as local preachers. So circuits then, within the Methodist tradition, are gathered into districts, and then the overarching organization was called an annual meeting. Now, let's look at some of the, so I hope that was useful, was it? Yeah. Okay, because I always find that you need to kind of have a sense of where everything goes and who, because these different names keep popping up, and which can sort of befuddle one. So let's have a quick look then at some of the 19th century changes that take place. Because what happens in the 19th century is that many of the 18th century structures collapse and are reformed and change and develop. Now, I've outlined here some of the basic drivers of what I think are some of the basic drivers of change in the 19th century. And the first one is the British state. The British state in the early 19th century begins, well, in the late 18th century really, begins to move towards its current sort of secular approach to the world. It no longer adopts this idea that everybody in the whole country has to be Anglican. They realize that this is untenable. And Ireland is a great example of how this one faith, one people model has utterly failed. And really, over the course of the 19th century, the British state makes a number of significant legislative changes which indicate its growing withdrawal from the area of official religion and its allowance of this to be happening in a voluntary way, and that they're not going to get involved. And this means really rolling back the penalties against people who are non-Anglicans. So you have in the late 18th century the rolling back of penal legislation. In the early 19th century, you have the rolling back of prohibitions against non-Anglicans becoming members of parliament, for example. By the 1860s and the 1870s, both atheists and Jews, considered completely persona non grata before this, are now also allowed now to enter parliament. So you can see how the state also refuses to get involved in theological debates and to rule on things, increasingly allowing denominations to sort these things out for themselves. Secondly, then, are these two rival theological developments, this spread of theological ideas. Evangelicalism, which is a movement of Protestant religious enthusiasm, really, which results in a very personal faith, a very committed faith, and a very active faith, a sense that everyone needs a conversion experience, and that it is the responsibility of those who have had one to ensure that the rest of the population has one as well. You can imagine the implications then of evangelicalism in the 19th century, and of course we're still kind of, I think, living through some of that today. Ultramontanism is a movement of Catholic theology in the 19th century, which emphasizes the centrality of the Pope, his importance, which tries to promote the a greater coherence and similarity of Catholic practice across the European Catholic churches. And then finally, I want to just talk very briefly about the social and economic changes. So in the 19th century, then there is the demographic changes. There's a massive growth in population, followed by the famine, followed by steady and significant population decline in Ireland. This has massive implications for the churches, in particular the Catholic Church, where 2 million people wiped out during the famine, largely Catholic, largely poor, largely also slightly distanced from the Catholic establishment, so leaving the Catholic Church in a very different position in the 1850s. And then there's this whole process of modernization, or secularization, if you will. The idea that Ireland's becoming more modern society, it's becoming more affluent, more consumerist, communications are better, and all of this is having I suppose, a deparochializing influence on people's belief structures. And as a result, then, what happens in the 19th century is that the Church of Ireland is deeply affected by all of these changes, to the point where in 1870 it's disestablished. Okay, so the British state moves to take away its privileged status in law. It's allowed to remain, but it now, from 1870, functions as a voluntary church, just like the Presbyterians. So there's no difference or distinction any longer in their status. That's not to say that they still don't get to be the elites, and that they're still not the religion of the landed gentry, by no means. And they work very well, and in fact the disestablishment is considered by most historians to be almost a time of revival and renewal for the Anglican Church, where they pull together and they go, right, we've got to establish our identity, we've got to reach out to our communities, we've got to reestablish what we're about. We can't rely on the state any longer. But this was only after like 40 years of one disappointment after another and a sense of betrayal on the part of the state. The Presbyterian Church was a vibrant organizational institution throughout the 19th century because the only way it would survive is if people believed in it and were prepared to commit and work to it. Its problem was theological change, was theological differences. And this contributed to many schisms, so that by the 1830s and 1840s there must have been 7 or 8 different Presbyterian denominations on the island of Ireland alone, and a few more that existed in Scotland that sort of got translated over here for a while too. But in the 1830s, these theological divisions, which largely focused around whether or not Jesus was properly God or that sort of thing, were resolved. In essence, the large majority pushed the small minority out of the Synod of Ulster. They went off and formed their own group called the Non-Subscribing Presbyterian Church in Ireland, and the remainder then were able to unite with some of the more conservative elements within Presbyterianism, together to, in 1840, form the General Assembly, which is the overarching body for all of the synods now within the official Presbyterian Church. The Catholic Church, I think, is the most interesting example of 19th century change, so I want to talk about it for sort of 2 minutes. 3, okay, because I think it's absolutely fascinating, and it's also the area that, so interestingly, has attracted the most attention from historians. Because obviously, by the 1700s, the Catholic Church as an institution was massively disrupted and was pretty much on its knees, and the Catholic community was probably not much better. However, despite the penal laws, most historians, Kevin Whelan in particular, argue that the penal laws did not prevent the Catholic Church from, over the course of the 18th century, making substantial gains in terms of institutional performance. So that by 1707, new bishops are being appointed. You see the return of regular clergy. You see the reestablishment of the parish structure. Now this is quite interesting because it influences family history in the sense that it was Catholics who had had their parish structure, in essence, taken off them by the Anglican Church at the Reformation. Okay? And this is very simplistic, right? So the medieval parish structure in Ireland, which exists, is really the Anglican parish structure. And the Catholic Church then, over the course of the 18th and the 19th century, reestablishes its parish structure, but using the characteristics and features of the time. So its new parishes do not exactly model or mirror those of the Anglican Church. And in some areas, parishes were changed, and in particular, parishes were refocused around new churches that were established in new centers of population, for example. Okay? So it's important then, if you're thinking about parish units, to be aware if you're thinking of an Anglican parish unit as opposed to, say, a Catholic parish unit. Other changes as well, the new emergence of a new middle class in particular, and the increasing training of clergy. So for the first time then in 1795, Maynooth Seminary is established. And so Ireland now has its own sort of Catholic training college. This isn't to say that there weren't massive problems, because there were. Clerical recruitment was problematic. You weren't getting the best candidates. The churches were in terrible condition. There was a real lack of resources to develop churches and church structure. And in particular, the poverty of the population meant that the Catholic Church, which in Ireland functions largely like a voluntary church, doesn't have the wealth that it requires to reestablish itself quickly and easily. So it doesn't have wealthy endowments, inheritances from people who have died. This begins to change in the late 18th century. And unfortunately, in all of this, Ulster is the worst off. So while Ulster is doing great when it comes to schools, it's doing terrible when it comes to Catholic infrastructure. Now, okay. So what I should say, just to introduce this slide and the ones that come after, is that Kevin Whelan, who's a historian of 18th century Ireland, has done what I think is probably still the most interesting work on the Catholic Church. And in particular, trying to establish when the sort of church begins to emerge as a new institution. And one of the measures that he uses is the date at which a church register exists for a Catholic church. So this graph here measures the date of first surviving Catholic parish registers for all of the churches that existed that he was able to find in Ireland. And he dates them from pre-1781 all the way up to sort of 1880. So you can see the bulge here is occurring from, roughly speaking, around 1800 to about 1830. So Whelan is using parish registers and their survival as a measure of sort of the return to normality within a church, that a church could now begin to think about establishing itself or operating normally. Now he also then looked at the regional variation of surviving registers. And again, I know it's very, very small, but if you look, you can see that very few early registers survived for Ulster. Pre-1750, 1750s and onwards, 1775 and onwards, and then post-1870. Only post-1870 do you begin to see a smattering then of Catholic registers emerging in Ulster. Speaking to the poor institutional infrastructure, here's another way of looking at it. The distribution of continentally trained priests in 1704. Once again, you can see the center of Catholic strength in Ireland is not in Ulster. Or, looking at it this way, the value of Catholic parishes in 1800. Worth more than £200? Worth 150 to 200? Or worth less than £50? Okay? So all of these things mount up and then tell us about the institution of the Catholic Church. And then there's another measure as well, the payment of this thing called the O'Connell annuity in the 1830s. Once again, the number of signatories from Ulster, very, very few. And then finally, he looks at this, the idea of church building as well. And he compares 4 dioceses across Ireland. 3 from the south and 1 that sort of just squeaks into Ulster. And you can tell, by close examination, that the peak of church building in Ulster is a few decades later than it is in the south and the west. So all of this points to the fact, really, which is that the Catholic Church was slow to get off the ground in Ulster. It was poorer than elsewhere, and that the centre of Catholic strength on the island of Ireland is really in the south and in the west. Okay? And when you look at another measure, which has been developed by David Miller, another historian, you can also see how this strength is manifested. Okay, so the dark bits are looking at attendance in pre-famine Ireland. Well, the whole map is looking at attendance in pre-famine Ireland. But the dark bits indicate attendance that's upwards of 100%. Okay, and as the colors get fainter, you can see then the decline in religious attendance. Okay? So once again, showing that it's in the sort of the more modern, the more affluent farming areas of the south and the west where the Catholic Church was strongest, and it was in the west of Ireland, amongst the Irish-speaking, labouring poor, that the Catholic Church was weakest. Now, you're probably thinking, what's any of this got to do with my family? I hope not. So I wanted to talk then about and looking at Killwater just a little bit. As I said before, there are no churches in Killwater Parish, and I've explained already the unique sort of situation that puts it in. If you look at the 1901 and the 1911 census, you can see that it's overwhelmingly Presbyterian, but with a significant cluster of Catholics and a smattering of Anglicans. You can also see that this is so I should have started with 1861, I suppose. So this is what you can extract from the 1861 printed censuses, although I appreciate that parliamentary papers are a bit tricky to get a hold of if you don't have access to an institutional library. So this is what really it shows for Killwater Parish in 1861. You can see, and they divided it into male and female, and they've looked first of all at Anglicans, then at Catholics, then at Presbyterians, then at Methodists, and then, like all other denominations, pretty much are listed here. So you can see that in Killwater, 73% of the population is Presbyterian, 20% of the population is Catholic, 4.5% of the population is Anglican, 0.9% of the population is Methodist, that's actually like 12 people, and 1.7%, or about 25 people, are all other persuasions, which I think is probably mistakes, or difficult to categorize in some way, right? Or people who have called themselves Christian. You've seen it on the census returns, I'm sure, from 1901. People who name themselves or call themselves these sorts of odd things that you would never expect. So this, I think, clearly, it's unsurprising, right? I mean, it's North Antrim, of course, is going to be a Presbyterian majority. And you can see, again, has it changed much? Here's a graph based on the material from 1901. And this is only a sampling of parishes from Killwater. So I think that the proportion of Presbyterians is probably a bit low. But what's interesting is the growth of Methodism, right, which is, I think, significantly higher, and the emergence of people calling themselves Church of England as opposed to Church of Ireland, which is, I also think, is an interesting development. This is the Anglican Church in Killwater, or in Carrincastle, I should say. And you can see there the very famous chestnut tree in the back, which is said to have been planted by a chestnut seed from the pocket of a washed-up Armada sailor. And it's in a fantastic location with a wonderful graveyard. But the graveyard reflects, I think, the complex relationship between Protestants in the area, in that this very large, very grand grave is in fact the grave of the Reverend Classen Porter, who for about 40 odd years was the minister of the non-subscribing Presbyterian church in Larne and Kilwater. This church here. Probably one of the oldest non-subscribing Presbyterian churches on the island, one of the oldest Presbyterian small p congregations in Ireland as well. And then here, just to give you an idea, is a Catholic church, which I'm not sure if it's still in operation, in the area of Craigenorn, in the south of the parish. But where people obviously in Kilwater went to church was in Larne, in the local town. And you can see again the range of architectural styles. I think that if we look at Kilwater at a townland basis, the Presbyterian character of 73% is far more complicated. So what I've done is I've taken 6 of the townlands and I've downloaded every single one of the 1911 census returns and calculated out the total population and its breakdown by religion. My little sample ended up having about 204 people in it. And what I think emerges, and I'm just going to then, I think, wrap it up very quickly after this, is a couple of things. One of which is that you have kind of, I think, a range really of different types of areas. So what I would say is that you've got this notion of the cosmopolitan townland, if you will, and that's the domain around Kilwater Castle. So on the Kilwater Castle estate, you would have had members of the Church of Scotland, people calling themselves Church of Scotland, people calling themselves Church of England. Because so many of the estate employees would have come from England to work on the estate, and they would not necessarily have been local people. So you have a much more sort of cosmopolitan and diverse sort of religious picture if you look at a landed estate and its workers. But you also get, I think, the townlands which are ruthlessly exclusive. Every single person in the entire townland is either Presbyterian or, in particular, you see this with the Catholic population. So although the Catholic population is only 20% of Kilwater as a whole, Mulla-Sandal townland is 100% Catholic, with maybe 3 Unitarians tossed in. Okay? Old Freehold, another strong sort of farming townland, is exclusively 98% Presbyterian. So you've got these small clusters, I think, within. And then you have, as what I term sort of the local distinctives. So because this is East Antrim, you have a substantial smattering of Unitarians or non-subscribing Presbyterians. Now, PRONI holds the records for 27 NSP congregations. So they were not a large denomination by any stretch. But if you look even at the names of the denominations for the registers which PRONI holds, you can see that NSPs are concentrated in sort of central and East Antrim and in the area of not really north down, but sort of mid down. Cumber, Dromore, that sort of area. So again, unsurprising then that, that Kilwater then reflects this sort of Unitarian sort of local emphasis. And then you have finally what I consider to be these outliers, right? Where you have a Presbyterian family with like 8 kids, and then there's the Catholic farm servant. How did he feel, I wonder? Or what about boarders, where you have a Catholic family and they have 4 Anglicans boarding with them? Go figure, right? What's that all about? And what has struck me the most are these families which clearly seem to reflect a mixed marriage or a mixed marriage background. And if I can find it here without too much difficulty, I thought I would just, yes. So in the complete, utter highlands of Kilwater Parish is the Unitarian Thomas Finlay, who cannot read. He's 45 and he's an agricultural laborer and he's married. His wife is Elizabeth Finlay and she's Unitarian as well. And then they have John Dinsmore, who is described as their stepson, who's a Roman Catholic. Okay? And then they have a stepdaughter, Elizabeth and Mary, who have a different last name, which is unreadable at present. And they're both Unitarians. So, I'm like, a second marriage and she's converted and calls herself Unitarian now, but lets her child continue to be called Catholic? So this sort of thing never rises up to the national level, does it? These sorts of complexities, these sorts of challenges to our picture of highly segregated, highly divided societies. And how wonderful wouldn't it be to have sort of family that kind of challenge those ideas? The Ogilvies, I can assure you, do not do any of those things, which is why I'm hardly talking about them today. Now, and I'm going to skip over this because I'm very conscious that the time is gone. And I wanted to very, very briefly, because we've been kind of trying to do a bit of skills work as well, and talk a bit about sources. And you'll notice I've managed to talk for this entire time and never mention church records or baptismal registers even once. For which I hope you'll forgive me. But I thought that what I would do would be to show you what you can do if you're trying to get a sense of the religious milieu in which your family's operating, particularly in an urban area. And simply because a while ago, a couple of months ago, I just did a wee analysis of Ballycastle. Because I had found these women, these lovely women, the Gilbert ladies, Kate and her daughter Mary Frances. Now, Kate and Mary Frances are Methodists living on Newmarket Street in 1901. And they're from Donegal. And I wonder what sort of a community there would be if you were a Methodist living in Ballycastle in 1901. And I had no idea. But a very easy way to find out how common it was to be a Methodist and to understand, therefore, the significance of maybe finding a family member in an unusual spot is to look at the street directories. And again, you'll be all very familiar with this. So, but just again to illustrate that your basic street directory entry, nothing surprising here. You've got your brief description of the town at the top. You've then got, depending on the year of the street directory, the separation out of the clergy and the gentry. Very handy indeed. And then you've got perhaps another category called places of worship. Now, what I did then was to take the street directories for Ballycastle between 1880 and 1900, which are online via the PRONI website, and I simply calculated then the number of congregations or religious groups there were. So I plotted them down the left-hand side, and then I plotted the change in clerical management of each one of these congregations. Okay? And you can see, and I don't have time to go into detail, but what I discovered was, in essence, that there is no Methodist church in Ballycastle. That there was a Methodist church in Ballycastle, but that by 1892 it no longer seemed to be operational. It was clear that the Gilberts had originally come to Ballycastle because Kate's husband was the Methodist minister there for a time. But he seems to have died, and they seem to have then stayed on. We can see pretty much that the Anglican churches are very stable, that they don't do anything, and the membership doesn't, and that the clergy, once they're in, they're there for life, right? So it's like 40 years, and there's no change every Sunday over and over. Okay, and as soon as the one guy, the one guy died or died probably halfway through my sample. And the other guy then kicks in, and it's exactly the same, right? So he's there, and you know, well into 1901, I'm sure. Whereas you see far greater movement of clerical leadership within the Catholic Church, for example. And that's, I think, what's most interesting, is that the number and size of Catholic churches over the course of the 1880s, over the course of that 20-year period, really grows and diversifies. And you see parish priests taking on more curates, and more churches being founded. So you can really see the emergence of the Catholic community in the Ballycastle area. But we need to be careful, right? Because there is the listing, the way people are listed in street directories isn't always even or the same. Not only that, the number of street directories that PRONI has increases the closer you get to 1900. So this can give you the feeling of more rapid change, but in fact it's only because you only have 3 directories between 1880 and 1890 to choose from. So sorry, it's the other way around. Change can feel greater in the earlier period of your sample, right? Does that make sense? You know that if you've got 10 street directories between 1890 and 1900, not a lot is going to happen in all of them. Whereas if you've only got 3 in the previous decade, quite a lot can happen. This enables us then to see that Methodists in Antrim really only form 1.2 to sort of 2% of the population. And so what it shows really, is that, so then what I did was that I downloaded every census return for the entire town of Ballycastle for 1901 and 1911 to check what the religious affiliation was and whether or not there were any other Methodists. Because there's really no other way of searching for that using the census online. So what I found was that there's only 13 Methodists in a town of 9,000 in 1901, and you've got 33 in 1911 in a town of about 9,000. So they're really a tiny minority. And the other thing I discovered as well was that really all of the Methodists are associated with the Coast Guard and with the lifeboat service based in Ballycastle. So they're not locals, they're all from England. They're all been imported, except for the poor Gilberts, who are from Donegal, and who are then in 1911 joined by 2 local people who in 1901 called themselves Presbyterian, but in 1911 say that they're Methodists. So, were the Gilberts active at converting 2 whole people? We don't know. Did they do it on their own? It's impossible to tell. So in this sense, I think you can maybe speculate a bit about how the Gilberts, potentially your family too, may have experienced their religious faith. You know? And how isolated they would have been denominationally. Where would they have gone for their religious services? The closest Methodist congregation, I think, is in Ballymena. Would they have perhaps attended Anglican services because of the close relationship between the 2 denominations historically? Again, you're open to interpretation. But what you do know is the significance of finding the Gilberts as Methodists in Ballycastle, and the likelihood or the typicality of that, which is the kind of thing that we've been trying to do all along, or trying to identify all along, really, in our understanding of our families. So I'm going to leave